The Middle East was a battlefield for most of the 20th century. But one of the hardest fought wars of all was in 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. For 3 weeks, the battle swung violently from side to side. It brought each within sight of victory and defeat. And it brought the superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, close to a nuclear showdown.
The Israelis were in no doubt they were fighting for their country's very survival. For the soldiers of Syria and Egypt, it was a battle for Arab territory and Arab pride.
No 20th century conflict has been as lasting and bitter as the struggle between Israel and its Arab neighbors. This is the story of the biggest battle between them. It's still such a sensitive subject in Egypt that they wouldn't let us film there. This is the story of the October War of 1973. On the morning of June the 5th, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt. It was followed hours later by attacks on Egypt's allies, Syria and Jordan. It would become known as the Six-Day War.
Almost 200 pilots of the Israeli Air Force took part in an incredibly ambitious airstrike. Their mission was to wipe out the Egyptian Air Force, the largest in the Arab world. It's estimated that Egypt lost 80% of its military capacity, and along with Syria and Jordan, suffered over 30,000 dead and injured.
The Israelis had practically destroyed Arab air power. Israeli intelligence was now sure the Arabs wouldn't try anything until they'd rebuilt their air forces. And that would take another 10 years. The Israelis were now supremely confident that if their neighbors so much as twitched, they would batter them into submission once more. But in Cairo, something had happened that the Israelis hadn't reckoned with. A new Egyptian president with a new sense of purpose, Anwar Sadat. When Sadat came to power in 1970, Egypt was still a demoralized country, smarting from the loss of the Sinai. Sadat was considered a moderate by many, but one of the first things he did was appoint a dynamic and popular new military commander, General Saad el-Shazli. Shazli was given the job of revitalizing Egypt's poorly trained and under-equipped army, because Sadat was determined to do what the Israelis least expected: fight back. Sadat had decided that the only way to win back the Sinai from the Israelis was to make war on them. His plan was to launch a spectacular crossing of the canal and retake a strip of land in the Sinai.
I thought of Sadat as a character out of Aida. I didn't take him seriously. He kept making grandiloquent pronouncements and never acted on them. So I, frankly, thought he was bluffing.
Kissinger was too preoccupied with the Vietnam War to give the Middle East much attention. Even when Sadat made another offer.
He wanted Israel to return to the 67 borders, in return for which Egypt would be willing to make peace, which was a big step because no Arab state had as yet ever flatly said that they would make peace. We were in no position to handle that.
Sadat told me that Kissinger had said, if all you have is a problem, I cannot deal with it. But if it becomes a crisis, then I can intervene.
المشكلة ساخنة أنا ممكن أتدخل.
Disappointed with American diplomacy, yet still unwilling to talk to Israel directly, Sadat set out to prepare for war.
في منزل الرئيس السادات في الجيزة وقال
The High Command met at Sadat's house in Giza. Sadat told us, there is no hope of a peaceful solution, and I will not surrender to Israel. So our only option is war.
He said, get me back just 10 centimeters of the Sinai, and I will negotiate a miracle.
Sadat then proposed a secret alliance with President Assad of Syria. They agreed to plan a joint attack on Israel. The Syrians hoped at least to recapture the Golan Heights, taken from them in 1967. To keep Israel's troops tied down, they needed Egyptian forces to advance across the Sinai. But the Egyptians had their own plan. They intended to limit their advance to territory protected by their anti-aircraft missiles in Egypt.
Our missiles could protect us for up to 12 kilometers. That would compensate for the inferiority of our Air Force.
Egypt's chief of staff urged Sadat to stick to their own plan.
He said, okay, we'll draw up a plan to show to the Syrians. This second plan had us advancing to the Sinai passes, but it was done just for the Syrians. The attack was due on Saturday, October 6th. On the Friday, I went down and looked across the canal. On the other side, nothing was moving. I went back and told Sadat, they can find out now. I don't care.
It was not till dawn the next day, as most Jews were preparing to go to synagogue for Yom Kippur, that Israeli intelligence finally became convinced that Egypt and Syria would attack within hours. The Israelis heard the call to arms on the radio and from rabbis in their synagogues. At 2 p.m., as civilians were reporting for duty, Egypt opened fire.
It was aimed as a limited operation. The land was not my aim at all. I wanted only to prove to the whole world that the Israeli theory of security would collapse and we would cross the canal and we could capture the butterfly. These were my aims. About 6 o'clock, I told my people, my forces, felicitations. The Israelis have lost their balance.
Sadat's armies drove the Israelis from the Suez Canal. Israel's Air Force tried to retaliate, but failed to break through Egypt's missile cover.
I remember coming to the canal when I arrived in my division after 24 hours of going without tanks across the desert on chains. I saw a young officer. He said, he looked at me, was like that. He could not believe. He said, we cannot stop them. We cannot stop them. Our forces, for the first time, suddenly felt that they cannot stop the Egyptians.
The Israelis suffered heavy casualties all day. By the end of the day, Israel was facing catastrophe. The Israelis had believed that once their army was in place, they would be victorious. Now they had to face the shocking truth that this hadn't happened. Prime Minister Meir sent an urgent request to the Americans, begging them to resupply the country. The Americans had responded to Prime Minister Meir's request for resupplies. For days, American planes arrived in Israel with huge numbers of tanks, shells, and new planes. Israel was in a much stronger position.
President Sadat yielded to Soviet pressure and gave the order to advance, much to the dismay of his chief of staff.
It was doomed to failure from the start. Israel's air force was much stronger than ours.
Now the war began to swing Israel's way. In 3 hours, 250 Egyptian tanks were destroyed. But Egypt still had 2 armies in the Sinai. The Israelis planned a daring coup. They set out to cut through the gap in the Egyptian lines, create a bridgehead over the canal, and sweep around to isolate the Egyptian Third Army. The architect of the plan was General Ariel Sharon.
We slipped through the Egyptian lines without major problems. But when we reached the canal, there was a ferocious battle.
We thought it would give the Israelis more time if I went to Moscow, because nothing could happen until I got there. While I was in the air, Nixon sent a message directly to Brezhnev saying that I was fully authorized to conclude, but I frankly wanted to stall.
This critical moment of Egypt's most powerful ally, the Soviet Union, made one final bid to help the Egyptians. The Soviet president, Leonid Brezhnev, told the Americans unless they agreed to send a joint US-Soviet peacekeeping force to the Middle East, he would send Soviet troops on their own. The Americans were determined that no Soviet troops would enter the Middle East. In a sudden escalation, America put its nuclear forces on alert. US nuclear missiles were readied in their silos, and 2 aircraft carriers with nuclear strike forces were ordered to the eastern Mediterranean. The implied threat of nuclear war forced Brezhnev to make a choice: to escalate or to climb down. Brezhnev decided to climb down, and no Soviet troops went to the Middle East. But the flurry of international pressure had made its mark. On October the 25th, the Israelis finally heeded the ceasefire, and the October War was effectively over.
Israeli confidence was shattered. They were no longer the invincible military power they had thought they were.
Despite the fact they'd suffered up to 30,000 casualties, perhaps in the end, the side that gained the most from this war was Egypt. The Egyptian crossing of the canal was seen as a major military achievement that restored Arab pride and gave President Sadat the confidence to make a spectacular bid for peace. In November 1977, the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, arrived in Israel. And in the Israeli parliament in Jerusalem itself, he became the first Arab leader to recognize the state of Israel.
ولقد جئت إليكم اليوم على قدمين ثابتتين.
Israel and Egypt were now on the road to peace, which culminated in 1982 with what Sadat had always wanted, a complete Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. But Sadat never saw it happen. On October the 6th, 1981, the 8th anniversary of the war, Anwar Sadat was assassinated by gunmen opposed to his peace treaty with Israel. The October War had claimed its last victim.
Write about you after you've gone. I should like them to write on my tomb. He has lived for peace and he has died for principle.